Today is Sunday, May 28th, 2006. I am Sarah Locker. It is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Strasburg, North Dakota. Can you please state your full name?
Father Leonard Anthony Eckroth.
And when and where were you born?
I was born October 7th, 1932 in Mandan, North Dakota.
Have you ever heard any stories about your birth?
Not really. I remember my parents mentioning they went to South Dakota to visit my aunt, my mother's sister and her family, and they said I cut my first tooth as they were crossing the border into South Dakota. That's the earliest memory I have.
Do you have any other early memories that you recall besides that one that you remember?
Well, I understand I had quite a bit of illness when I was a youngster. The scarlet fever was going around, and I caught that, and afterwards I had some after effects, rheumatic fever too, I think. And the doctor used to come to our home at least twice a week to give me shots to kind of get me on my feet and revive me, and I kind of outgrew that, and I'm still around.
So you did have a doctor come out?
Yes, our family doctor he did house calls, and he'd come to our home about twice a week to take care of me.
Was this for just a couple months?
Oh, it must have been for close to a year.
Wow. Were you able
before school age, before I started school.
Were you able to go outside and play and do anything?
Oh, I wanted to, but they wouldn't let me. They kept me inside.
Other than shots, do they give you anything else to try to help you get better?
I suppose they did, but again, I was probably only about 4 or 5 years old, so it was hard to remember all that.
Yeah, definitely. Do you know if anybody else had to see the family doctor?
Oh, most of us did. 2 other brothers, I think, had scarlet fever too, and we were, I think, quarantined for a while.
Oh, so you 3 kind of hung out together. So you did. What would you guys do to pass the day, the 3 of you together?
Well, they were older, so and one was younger yet, and their effects weren't as lasting. They didn't get rheumatic fever, they just had the scarlet fever, I think.
Okay.
And so they got out and played with their friends. And
I
I was worried that I wouldn't even get to start the first grade on time, but finally I made it through, and the doctor said, yeah, you can go to school.
Wow. So it's for at least a year. Wow. Wow. Let's talk about your family a little more. Can you tell me about your grandparents on your father's side?
No, I can't, because I didn't even know them. They were deceased before I was born.
Okay.
Both my father's parents, my mother's parents.
Okay. And did both sets or only one set come over from Russia?
Just the one. My dad's parents came from Russia. My mother was of German-Swiss background, and her parents came from Switzerland. They were living in Switzerland before they came to America.
Okay. Do you know what part of Russia your grandparents on your father's side are from?
About 200 miles from Odessa, a village called Karlsruhe. Okay. And my dad was only about 2.5 years old when his parents came over.
Wow. Did your dad ever share stories that your grandma and grandpa would have shared with him about Russia and what it was like?
Well, we have a little bit of a family history that was put together when my parents had their 50th wedding anniversary, and there's some stories in there about maybe a year or 2 before they came over here. A lot of people were leaving Russia because the Russians were making it a little tougher on the German people. They had to learn Russian. They had to maybe serve in the Russian army, which they were promised earlier they wouldn't have to do. And so they began to leave, and they'd have farm auctions and sell their machinery and things. And one day my grandpa went to one of these auctions, and he bought a horse, I guess, and brought it home, and he said to Grandma, he says, I don't know, I did the right thing. Maybe we should be going to America too, like a lot of our friends are doing. And Grandma was supposed to have said, better now than later. And so they decided. And when they went all the way across Austria and Germany, and then to Rotterdam, where they boarded a ship to come to America. And my dad, I just read this over again today, he was telling later on, just he and his father were the only ones that didn't get seasick. I think it took 17 days to cross the ocean. And then they spent a couple of days in New York going through customs and that, boarded a train all the way to Mandan, North Dakota, where they had relatives and friends that were living.
And did they come over and start farming here? Or did they move in?
That was their intent, but I don't think that's what happened. It was in the winter, and there was 2 feet of snow in early November when they got to Mandan, and that was kind of discouraging. He had $17 left in his pocket, so he stayed with some relatives and found some work. He did, try to settle some land and prove it up so they could have it with the intent of farming. But he ended up doing carpenter work and things like that. Okay. And stayed right there. And my dad later on tells how not so many years later, his dad had a stroke when my dad was about 14 years old. That must have been about 12 years later. And my dad had to quit school. He had started high school for about 2 weeks, and then his dad had this stroke, so he began to help support the family. He went to work on the railroad, and his mother took in work cleaning and washing clothes and things like that to help support the family.
Wow. So did you grow up on a farm?
No, not at all. Okay. I spent one summer doing some farm work, helping out, but
that was about it.
Got a taste of it.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about your father a little bit. Can you describe what kind of a man he was?
Well, he was the boss of the family. Mom was rather gentle, but when Dad said something, you listened. And if we were misbehaving, there was a large family. There were a lot of boys. There were 11 children. And if we got a little too noisy and didn't settle down at night to sleep, Mom would kind of call us first and say, well, you better be quiet or your dad will come upstairs. And sure enough, when he put his first foot on the first step, we settled down. And he had a habit of pulling our ears when we were naughty.
So he disciplined you and pulled the ears?
Yes.
Would you do anything else for disciplining if you were acting up? Or
sometimes we got a spanking too. One time he spanked me, and I wasn't the one he was supposed to spank. It was my older brother that had done whatever was wrong. And I thought to myself, well, there were many times I should have had a spanking and didn't get it.
No point in telling him that you had the wrong one?
No.
Can you tell me when your father was born in Russia?
He was born in the year 1889, March 22nd.
And what was his name?
Louis, or Ludwig, but they called him Louis.
Oh, okay. You've obviously said he can express his anger by punishing the boys. How do you express his love for you guys?
He would involve us in things. He helped us to get interested in sports a little bit. He would play catch with us, softball, but in gardening, he let us help him in the garden. That was his hobby. And as we grew up, he enjoyed fishing and hunting, and all of his boys took it up, and even some of the girls enjoyed it. And he'd take us along, and those were precious moments we had together.
So he expressed both ends of the spectrum
of
emotions to you. How would you describe your relationship with your father?
Love and respect, basically, yes. A little fear, maybe sometimes, which is good.
Mm-hmm. Can you share some special memories you have of him, or some favorable memories you have of your father?
One time when I was with him, when we were out hunting in the fall of the year, hunting pheasants, he and I were walking on one side of a creek, I think, or a draw with brush, and I was probably in the 8th grade or 7th grade, and a pheasant or two got up, and they were close to where I was, and I was fortunate enough to shoot well enough to bring them both down. And I was waiting for some affirmation from him, and it wasn't coming. So I looked over towards him and I said, "Dad, did you see me peel those two off?" He didn't say anything. He walked a few more steps further, and 3 birds got up, and he was able to bring all 3 of them down. And he looked over towards me and he says, "Son, did you see me peel those 3 off?"
So he also is a humorous man.
Oh, yes.
He could joke and play as well.
Very much so.
Any other stories that you have of him? Did he have any old sayings or old stories he used to share?
He had a lot of friends on the railroad, and many years later I met the daughter of one of his best friends, a fellow by the name of Johnson. His nickname was Clinker, because he, in those days, the steam engines would throw up a lot of ashes, and they'd get into your eyes, and they'd call them clinkers. And this man was always rubbing his eyes, and so he got the name Clinker. And Clinker was kind of I never met him, but from the stories my dad told, he was kind of a little bit rowdy sometimes, and he drank a little, sometimes too much too. And one time when he was working in the yards as a switchman, like my father, Clinker was being a little careless with the shifting of these boxcars around, switching them from one track to the other, and he'd maybe give his signal a little bit too late or something, and these boxcars were bouncing together, shaking very strongly, and some of them were grain cars, and grain was falling out of the cars in the cracks in the floor of the boxcars. And apparently the man who was in charge of the crew heard all this noise, the trains, the cars bumping together, and so he went down to see what was going on, and he found that it was Clinker that was one that was probably the guilty one, who was not tending to his work well enough. And so he walked over to Clinker, and he was in the winter time, and he stopped Clinker, called him over, and he said there was a lot of grain lying between the rails of the track where one of these cars had lost some grain. And he said to Clinker, he said, "What's that?" He pointed to the wheat. "Oh," he says, "Mr. Robinson," he says, "that's winter wheat." "Well," he says, "it's not seeding time yet." He said, "Take it easy on those cars. Don't be so rough with them." And then he went over and told my dad, he said, "How do you scold somebody like that?" He got his message to him, and the man was more careful. But many years later, when I was in one of my early parishes, there was a lady in church one Sunday, a visitor, and after church I met her, and she said, "Your name is Eckroth." I said, "Yes." She says, "You wouldn't happen to be related to Louis Eckroth, would you?" And I said, "Well, yes, that was my father." "Oh," she said, "I'm so happy to meet you." She said, "Your father was my dad's best friend." And I said, "Your name is Johnson? Would your dad have been called Clinker Johnson?" "Yes," she said. She was so happy.
So your dad was really active in the community too,
Oh, yes.
Being friends with everybody else.
He was a volunteer fireman too for many years.
What other
in the city of Mandan.
So
At his funeral, one of the fire trucks came out and led the procession.
He was a volunteer fireman. He was a switchboard operator at the railroad.
Switchman.
Switchman. And then he also had the garden. And then he also was a hunter and a fisherman and all that. Any other professions?
And he loved to sing. He sang in a male glee club in Mandan, which was there for many years. That reminds me of another story. My older brother Eddie was at a concert that the glee club was giving. And my dad had a solo, and he was painted up like a black man. He sang some Negro spiritual, I suppose. And my brother spoke out loud during my dad singing this song. He said, "Oh," he said, "that's my paw," he said. And my dad said he could hardly keep singing. He kind of lost it for a moment.
Started laughing at your brother. So did all of your brothers and sisters get along well with your father?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Did he have you guys sing at home as well?
Once in a while, there's a teacher friend that used to come to our home and played the piano, and my dad would sing, and then sometimes we'd get in on it too. And many years later, when my dad was alone, my mother had died earlier, when he and I would go someplace, instead of listening to the radio on a trip, we would sing songs together. And I'd always start off with one song to get him going. And he knew a lot of songs, the words to all of them. And I just kind of listened, but I'd get him started on the song, the Whiff and Poof song.
What's that one?
To the table down at Maury's, to the place where Louis dwelt. That was his name. And he'd take over and just carry on. We'd go for hours sometimes, and he'd be singing all the way. The day before he died, he sang Irish Eyes Are Smiling.
How did your father experience any hard times with the 30s that you know of, since you were rather young?
Fortunately, he was able to work through all those years. There might have been a strike or something for a while, and then he went to work temporarily delivering groceries, if I'm remembering everything right. Mm-hmm. But then went back again to the railroad and, continued. He worked there for 50 years, I think, on the railroad till he retired.
All right. So before the little break there, you were telling me about your father coping and having to go to the grocery store and work there for a little bit.
Yes. He had a horse, Dan, and he would hook it up to a carriage and haul groceries for this grocery store, for Fitzsimmons, an Aurora store, I think it was called. And he'd tell the story about every noon they'd blow the whistle in town, like today would be a siren, I suppose. And Dan, the horse, knew that, and he knew that was time to go home and be sure he'd get some feed, some hay. And he said he always had to remember, as he got close to that time, be sure and tie the horse up so that it wouldn't get away from him. And one time there was some reason he wasn't able to deliver the groceries. Another man was going to do it, and this man was clear across town, far away from the grocery store, and he didn't know this, that you had to watch out for that noon whistle because the horse would just take off on its own. And sure enough, he says, this fellow came out after the whistle and the horse and the wagon was gone. He had to walk all the way back across town about a mile to get to the grocery store. And my dad said, well, I was sorry I didn't explain that to you. He said, you want to be sure and tie him up just before that whistle or you'll lose him.
He goes home.
He's going home for some feed. After my dad, when I was a little older, I remember one winter he was laid up in the hospital. He had some surgery. And so there wasn't much income during that time. And it was a little harder that winter for my mother to buy groceries and that. And we kind of lived on cottontail rabbits most of that winter. And we got so tired of them. And my mother would try to hide it a little bit. She'd grind it up and mix a little pork with it, which wasn't very costly, and make patties out of it so we wouldn't know that it was rabbit. But it was good to go through that experience too. And we never had hardly any time in the early years a family car. We had an uncle and aunt who sometimes loaned us their car if we needed one, but we were close enough to school, close enough to the church, close enough to the grocery store, and my dad walked to work every day. In those days, he had to work all 7 days. He didn't have a day off unless he asked to take a day off and laid off for a day, which he didn't do very often. He had a lot of mouths to feed.
Children.
Some of the older ones were able to find work and helped along a little bit too, bought their own clothes maybe.
Okay. He never had to resort to Any WPA programs or
No,
anything like that?
no. He kept on with the railroad.
Found a way to make do.
Yes.
Can you tell me when and where your father died?
He died over in Bismarck in a nursing home. He was there in assisted living sort of at first at Merrillack Manor, and then later on at St. Vincent's Home, where he died. He died on April 12th, I think 1985.
So he still lived to be an older man.
Yes. He was 96 when he died.
Wow. Really an older gentleman.
Yes.
Wow, nice long life.
One day my sister was visiting him, and he was crying when she came over. And he said, well, what's wrong? What are you crying about? She said, well, I'm getting so old, there won't be anybody at my funeral, he said.
I've outlived everybody else.
There were plenty there. There were a lot of priests and nuns that knew him, and a big family, a lot of cousins, relatives. The church was almost full.
Did you see your aunts and uncles and cousins a lot?
Some of them, my dad's two sisters lived in Mandan, and they were both older than he was, and they were still living when I was a little boy. And they were kind of like grandparents to me in a way. The grandparents had died earlier before I was born.
That's right.
They tried to spoil us.
So they would come visit fairly often?
Yeah, they lived close by, and we would go to their home too quite a bit.
Okay. Did you have a favorite aunt or uncle, or one that you were closer with?
Yeah, I think my dad's sister Edith and her husband, whose name was Louis too. They were kind of my favorites. They kind of adopted a couple of us kids, my older brother first, and one of my older sisters. And my one older sister, she lived with them for a while. I think she just kind of camped there. And she thought her brothers were pretty mean. And she says, oh, those Eckroth kids, they're terrible. She said, I said, you're an Eckroth too.
Can you describe your aunt and uncle, Edith
and Louis Holmes? Yeah. Well, the aunt was quite strict. In fact, after her husband died, she came and lived with us, and she tried to take over and run the family. And that didn't go over too good with parents, you know. But she had a good heart underneath. She was very kind too. But her husband, Louis, he was very gentle, and he would do all kinds of things for us kids. He'd take us for a ride out to his old farm and take us down to the pool hall. We weren't supposed to be in there, but he'd take us along and buy us a milkshake or an ice cream cone or something. The uncle had a job as a janitor in a bunch of doctors' offices, and so later on, when it got to be too much for him to do it, his wife kind of took over, and she'd often take one of us boys, most often myself, to help do the janitor work. So every Saturday afternoon for about 3 or 4 hours we'd be in there, as well as every night. We'd have to do the major cleanup on Saturday afternoon. And we'd always have a treat afterwards, an ice cream cone.
Is that your payment?
That was part of our payment, yeah. That was our payment.
Nice. Did you have any cousins that you were closer with or that you saw a lot?
Yes, I think I'm still very close to one of them who lives right here in the same town as I do. He moved here after his wife died, and later on remarried here too, a widow lady. But their family and our family were next door neighbors, so we were almost like one family. So they were very close, and some of his brothers too. We had a lot of good times together. As children, my older brothers played together with some of them, and later on we'd visit each other quite a bit. I must have married 2 or 3 of my cousins already, older ones.
Can you tell me about this cousin that you were closer with? What was he like?
Well, Joe, my one that's living here now, he moved out to Montana, and a lot of times they would come back for a visit, or he was, again, about 10 years older or more than I am, maybe 20 years older, and he enjoyed some of the same interests, fishing and hunting, so I would try to go out there once a year in the summer months and spend about 3 or 4 days trout fishing with him in the mountains, and we have a lot of good memories together.
Can you share a childhood memory of you guys playing together?
Well, again, I say he was at least 15, 20 years older, so we didn't play together a lot, but I could share, adult experiences too that we had. Yeah. We were fishing along the river one time in a rubber raft floating down, I think it was a Jefferson stream, which is part of the Missouri, one of the sources of the Missouri River. And we were going along. We looked up, and right next to us almost was a big moose, way bigger than any of us. And I thought my cousin was pretty big. And he grabbed one of the paddles. He was going to defend himself with the paddle. And I said, well, that wouldn't do much. The moose could really, that'd be like a toothpick by the moose. And nothing happened, and the moose settled down, and we continued drifting on further down the stream. But it was kind of and I shot a picture of the moose, too, as we were going by.
Had time to think of that.
A year later, his nephew and I guess he'd be my second cousin, was using that raft, and the river was very high and dangerous, and he and 3 other fellows were coming down, and they went over a rapids where there was a bunch of logs, and 2 people jumped out of the raft. They were close enough to shore, and 2 of them rode it out, and one of them was this second cousin. They drowned in the river there in Montana, the Columbia River. So the same raft that I had been in the year before with those guys.
The same river you'd been on before as well?
That one I hadn't been on.
Oh, okay.
It was kind of during flood stage too, where there had been a lot of rain and melting snow coming. It was a sad moment, though.
Definitely. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about something a little lighter.
Okay.
Tell me about your mother.
Oh, Mom, she was so gentle, so kind, so soft-spoken. I have a picture of her when she was making, when she got married, she didn't know how to cook at all. And my dad's mother kind of taught her a lot of the German dishes. So one Friday evening when she was making what they called ramdudel, I took my camera out and took a picture of her. She was rolling out the dough and using a filler, I think cottage cheese and whatever they mix with it, and making these noodles. And that's one of the nice pictures I have yet of her.
Did she become a good cook?
Oh, she did. She could bake pies and chocolate cake. Oh, golly. Every day when us kids would come home from school, the first thing we'd do, we'd look in the cupboard for her chocolate cake. She made one a day, I think. There's so many of us, and sometimes neighbor kids would drop in, she'd give them some too. So we'd have a piece of chocolate cake and a glass of milk. And some of us had pretty big appetites. And she'd always say, be sure and leave some for your dad when he gets home from work.
Did she make anything else that you really enjoyed?
Oh, every Sunday almost it was chicken dinner we'd have together.
How would she make the chicken dinner?
Well, I wouldn't remember, but it was real tender and lots of gravy with it. I don't know if it was cream gravy or what, but it was delicious. And we'd be sitting around this round table, kitchen table, and when you start picking up that chicken, your hands get all full of the gravy and stuff, and we'd say, pass the family napkin, and what she'd do is she'd just give us one of the dish towels, and that went around the table.
It was easier. How did she express her emotions, her anger and her love?
Well, I think everything they did in concert, I think, Mom and Dad. If we wanted something, we had a better chance if we'd ask Mother first. But often she'd often say, well, have you asked your dad yet, too? Or you better go ask Dad. And if we wanted something, she bought all the groceries. Dad gave her so much money every payday. And if we needed a little spending money, we'd go to her and we'd say, can we borrow some money? And she'd just give it to us for what we needed.
So she was a lot more, she didn't have as much strictness in her as your dad did.
That's right. He was truly the heart.
So did she ever discipline you, or did she always leave it to your
If she
dad?
had to, she would, if Dad wasn't there. But I remember I got slapped one time. That was about the only time that I remember where she really disciplined me a little bit. I really had it coming, I'm sure. Paydays, when Dad would get off work on payday and we'd kind of supper together, but in the evening he would say, well, today's payday. He'd always bring home some candy too when he paid the grocery bill. I think years ago the people that run grocery stores would often, when you paid your bill, they'd give you some candy to take home for the kids. That was kind of a tradition they had. But Dad would also say, let's have a Dutch lunch, he called it. In the evening about 8:30, 9 o'clock, he would go over to the bar nearby and get a half a gallon of beer maybe, and 2 or 3 bottles of soda pop for the kids. And during Lent, it was probably pickled herring we'd have with cheese and crackers for that Dutch lunch. It was a way to celebrate payday.
That's really nice of him. What all did your mother do? What were her jobs at home and around the house?
Well, before she got married, she worked in a tailor shop. She and her sister worked in this tailor shop in Mandan, and I think that shop is still in business, Toman's, and that goes back over 100 years. The city of Mandan is celebrating their 125th anniversary this year. So they have some pictures in the store, and my mother's on the picture. So, and she said she made part of a suit, maybe the trousers, and her sister did the suit coat or something. And they kind of teamed up on making suits. So after she got married, she did all the sewing. She made a lot of our clothes. Kind of, when we were little children, very self-conscious too. And if she would buy some clothes, when we were small, we were on our knees so much, we'd wear out the knees. So she'd get us a pair of corduroy pants, and she'd take the back pockets off. They were sewed on, and she'd put them on the knees. And I'd come to school, and I was the only kid that had pockets on my knees, and I was kind of embarrassed about that. But it was very practical, too.
You're allowed for the German cake.
Yeah.
For the chocolate cake all the time. So did she mainly stay at home?
Oh, she was a home person, yes.
Did she help with the garden at all, or anything else?
She liked to, yeah. In fact, it was kind of comical one year. That was when they were retired already. They had a large garden. My dad had planted potatoes, and then in the fall of the year they were going to dig up the potatoes. And my mother, she never could waste anything. And so as she was peeling potatoes for supper sometimes, she would take the peelings and go out on the edge of the garden somewhere where nothing had been planted, and she'd take the peelings, especially if they had those little pieces that hang on like out of the eyes. And in the fall when they were digging up the potatoes, my mother said to my dad, well, aren't we going to dig up my potatoes? Oh, your potatoes, there won't be anything there. And they went over and dug up the potatoes, and she had bigger potatoes than my dad, which didn't go over too good. She was so proud that her potatoes had done so well.
A little greener thumb for potatoes. What was your relationship like with your mother?
Oh, it was just wonderful. She was so understanding. If you had done something and you needed to talk to somebody, she'd be the one you'd want to go to. Maybe you were a little afraid to tell Dad what you did wrong, but Mom would understand and forgive.
Could always sit and talk. That's nice. How did she deal with the harder times when money wasn't going around as much in the 30s?
Well, again, my dad had a pretty stable job with the railroad. They weren't affected by the Depression as much, or the drought that the farmers were having. So we weren't really hurting as much as some people were, I think, except that we were a large family.
She just had to hide.
But she was very economizing. She wouldn't waste anything. She would turn lights off if they weren't being used. She tried to teach us to and close the door, don't let the cold air in.
Being resourceful.
She was never very healthy. She had health problems, pneumonia and things like that. And there was a time we had to get one of our cousins in to help do the cooking and the cleaning until Mom recovered from her pneumonia. So a lot of times she would say, close the door, I don't want to get pneumonia again. Any draft, she would feel it. Yeah. Yet she lived to be almost 81.
Wow, so when did she pass away?
She died about I was at Tioga at that time, somewhere about 1971 or so.
Okay. And where was she at when she passed away?
They were living at Powers Lake, which was near, it was a kind of a rest home or retirement home too, which was only 20-some miles from Tioga where I was stationed. They moved up there because that was closer to another brother who was a teacher in Bow Bells and myself at Tioga.
Did you ever hear how your parents met?
You know, I don't recall that part. Well, I think my dad's, one of his friends was an uncle to my mother, and it might have been through them. Uncle Frank was a fireman too, and maybe he might have had something to do with to get him acquainted.
How many, you said they had 11 children?
Yes, well they had 14, but they lost 3 little ones that were less than a year old.
Just due to sickness?
Yes.
Okay. Can you list off the order of your siblings from oldest to youngest?
The 3 that died, I know their names, but I don't know what order they were in, but the oldest brother was Frank. He was 20 years older than I am. And then another brother, Gabriel, was probably about a year and a half younger than Frank. And then there was Caroline. She became a sister, Sister Caroline. And Louise was the next one. She was the one that lived up in Alaska after she got married, or shortly before she got married. After her husband died and she retired from where she was working, she came and kept house for me for 23 years. And now she's still living, but she's out on the West Coast with some of her children. There's another one, Eleanor, who became a sister. She's at University of Mary, at the monastery there. She's retired now too, but she taught school for many years. And then there's William, who's a priest too. He's retired in Minnesota at St. John's Abbey. His name is Father Richard. And then there's Edward, who lives retired out in Portland, Oregon. I'll be seeing him in another month or so. I'll be going out there. And then myself, and Charles and Anthony. Oh, I missed one. Marie, my sister Marie. But we'd still worked together quite well and got along.
Being boys.
Right. Up in the upstairs of our house, which was added on after the family got bigger, we had one room for the girls. 2 girls slept in there. And then there were 4 of us boys slept in the bigger room. And we had 2 full-size beds. And there wasn't much space between the beds, about that far, maybe a foot or 2. And sometimes we'd move the beds together and really carry on, make a lot of noise and wrestle and fight, you know. And one time, one of the boys must have kicked a little too hard, and he went right through the wall, through the plasterboard.
And how did your parents react to
Well,
that?
our mother learned about it first, and she said to the boys, the older 2 boys, she said, "You better fix that before your dad comes home." So they covered it up with some wallpaper and painted over it or something, and I don't think he ever knew about it. I think Mom helped cover it up a little bit.
Mom realized Dad would be a little upset.
And another time, my brother Tony and I was chasing him, and he was trying to run out the back door of the house, and there was a glass pane there, and right behind the door was a telephone hanging on the wall, and I just knew that the way he threw the door, it was going to hit that telephone and break the glass. So I tried to brace the door frame, and I missed the frame. My hand went right through the glass. And Dad was about ready to come home for dinner, for lunch. So I said, we got to do something. It's winter time, too. So I said, I think there's a piece of plywood down in the basement. Maybe I could cut that to fit where the glass was. And about the time we put it in, Dad was coming home. And I tried to say, well, you know, Dad, this will work better than glass. It'll keep the cold out. He says, yeah, I was going to keep the light out, too, he said. So he was not very happy about it, but we were pretty much grown-up kids, and he wasn't about to discipline us very much about that. One of the memories, I want to be sure and get this in, for a while as a young priest, I was stationed close to home at Bismarck. And one afternoon, I knew my dad loved to fish as much as I did, or maybe even more. And I drove over and I said, I've got a few hours free. I could take you fishing if you like. And he said, oh, well, let's do that. And I remember Dad as being kind of pokey. Everything had to be just so. And it took me so long to get ready to go someplace. You often, men think women are hard to get going sometime when you want to go someplace. They got so many things they have to take care of, so much detail. Well, Dad was, in that respect, even worse, I think. So I said, you know, I only have a couple, maybe 3 hours. Why don't you get what you need, and I'll try to help you along, get some of the stuff, put it in the car for you, so we can get going. I'll get your pole, your fish pole, and your bucket for the minnows, and your tackle box. And I got him in the car, and I waited for him. He finally came out to the car, and I said, have you got everything you need? No, he said, I must have forgot something. I don't know what it is. I said, maybe your pipe? I think that's it, he said. So he went back, got his pipe and his tobacco, got in the car, and I said, can we go? Is there anything else? There's still something I forgot, he said. What could it be? I forgot to kiss Mama goodbye. You better do that first, I said. I noticed as we grew up and there were just Mom and Dad, they seemed to be much more affectionate. I think the German-Russian people were kind of slow to show their affection in front of their children. But afterwards, when the kids are gone, you know, they can show that again and be more free about it. When we went sometimes on trips, my mother wouldn't go. She didn't feel well. We'd go visit some of the family elsewhere. And first thing when we got home, he'd say, I got to go see how Mom is. He would he'd take her by the hand, hold her hands, and say, well, how are things while I was gone? It's such a wonderful relationship.
Do you think they just got busy with raising you kids that they got a little sidetracked from being with each other?
Yeah, but I think too they were of the mind to you don't want to show your affection for each other. It's more private.
So after you kids got older, you began to realize how good a marriage your parents had.
Yes.
That is really neat. It's really sweet of them to do. Now, let's go back to talking about you and your siblings, you and your brothers and sisters. Was there ever any competition between any of you with school or when you would go fishing or hunting?
Well, I'm sure there was, you know. And we always thought the older ones were kind of a little bossy sometimes with their younger brothers and that, you know. They wanted to go by seniority, I think.
Was there a brother or sister you were closest to?
Different ones at different times. The oldest one, Frank, I thought very close to him. He seemed to be kind of concerned about a younger brother. He'd share things with me. I'd come over, even though he had his own family. When I would visit him, he'd say, well, you need some fishing pole or you need some fishing tackle. He'd just give me some of his gear and help me out. And another one would do the same thing, Gabe. He would be very kind too and very generous. And he was a watchmaker, and if we had trouble with our watches, we could bring them to him, and he'd take care of them, get them going again. Yeah.
So depending on what you need, each have
Yes.
their own specialty.
And I think my older brother that became a priest had a lot of influence on my vocation too. I looked up to him, admired him. And a couple of my best friends, one 2 years older and his younger brother who was my classmate, they decided they wanted to be priests too. And I said, well, if they can do it, I guess I can too. And I'd been thinking about it off and on as a child. I think first I was making my first Holy Communion, probably about 8 years old.
So you first thought maybe it might be
Uh-huh.
what you want to do. Were you able to talk to your parents about
Oh,
your
sure.
thoughts of becoming a priest?
Oh, yeah.
What was their reaction?
Very positive. They were very proud of the older sisters who had become nuns and the older brother who was studying to be a priest too. And they were always close to the church. They had good friendship with the sisters. My dad sang in the church choir. He knew all those sisters, and he was very close to some of the priests there in town. We lived just a block and a half from church, and they would drop in at our house quite often, sit at the kitchen table on the bench, and they felt really at home there. And we did things together. We'd sometimes go fishing or hunting with some of the priests too. They were very good to us. We played hockey and skating and stuff like that. I always tell people the wonder I became a priest. I lived a block and a half from church and a block and a half from the police station. I had to behave.
There's nowhere safe for you in town. But you did play games with the nuns and the priests
Oh,
in
yeah.
the parish. And now you said you played hockey. What would you use for skates?
We had, some of us had just clamp skates, and we didn't have real hockey. We'd take old pieces of lath and make a hockey stick out of them, you know. And the priest we had, he was older. He couldn't skate very good, so we got him to be the goalie. He was good with kids, though. He would, even though he wasn't skilled in any of those sports that kids were, he would like to be around them and encourage them. We didn't have a gym in our school, so the memorial building, which was the gym they used for sporting events, they got permission to use that on Saturday mornings, so the kids from the Catholic school could come there. And this priest, he knew nothing. He couldn't coach or anything, or he couldn't hardly referee, but he'd just be there. And because he was there, we were allowed to be there. So he'd do that as a favor to the kids.
Tell me more about the games that you would play.
Well, around the neighborhood, we'd play a lot of softball in the evenings. There were lots of kids in our neighborhood. So whatever was a seasonal sport, we would play it. We'd play softball, and then in the fall of the year, we'd play football on a vacant lot, maybe somewhere nearby. A lot of nights, we'd just get together and play games like kick the can or any eye over.
Now, for softball, did you play it the same way it's played now?
Yes, pretty much. Uh-huh.
What about
We didn't have much room because it was cut in the backyards of everybody and the alleyway between the homes. So we'd, if there were enough kids, we'd make 3 bases. Otherwise, we'd just play one base, and you have to run back from the first base back to home again. And whoever caught the ball would be up to bat. If somebody hit a fly ball and somebody caught the ball, then they'd get to bat right away. Work up, they called it.
It works. What would you use for a bat? Did
Oh,
you have bats?
Yeah, we had bats,
Okay.
and a
And gloves and
softball.
balls,
Right.
all that stuff. You mentioned that you guys played football as well.
Yes.
Would you play 9-man football? How would you play it?
No, it was depending on how many people were there.
Was it similar 4 touchdown or 4 downs until the other team would get the ball?
That's quite a while ago. I don't remember the rules anymore, but we played on a really narrow area, maybe only as wide as this room here, maybe 20 feet or better in width, on a boulevard of a. I know that was one of the places where we played, was right near the street. We had to be careful. Cars were going by and everything. And we just try to run the ball, or they'd do some passing, and we had 2 goals, And I think we played tackle. Sometimes later on, we just touch, we have to just touch with both hands to stop the play.
Do you remember what the ball was like that you would use?
It was regular football.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. We were modern.
Living in town helped. Do you remember where you learned the games from?
Just from older kids in the neighborhood, from brothers and that. Yeah.
In the winter, besides skating, or in hockey, were there any other games that you would play?
Well, what was the game called? Something about goose. Catch the goose or something. They have a big circle and a path across, like perpendicular line, and I think in the middle you were free. You could, nobody could tag you, but if you went around the circle, you could tag, then you were the guy that was it. You had to catch the others.
Do you ever
Run, Goose, Run, was that what it was called?
Is it Fox and Goose?
Fox and Goose, there you go.
Heard a couple of games. Were there ever any days in the winter where it was just so cold you had to stay inside instead?
Oh, yes.
How would you entertain yourself then?
Well, we had building blocks, and we'd make things out of that, fortresses, and we had lead soldiers we'd play with that we made out of, we had molds, we'd pour lead and get the lead sometimes from the railroad roundhouse where they had a lot of lead that they threw away. We'd play war, we called it war. Make guns where we could shoot some of these blocks at the lead soldiers and the other guy's fort, and that would be part of the game in the wintertime. Or we'd put puzzles together too.
So you bought the molds just from the store?
Somebody gave us one for Christmas. It had 4 or 5 different images, some of them on horseback, and a couple of them were like infantry and that, and I don't remember all of them, but we made our own soldiers.
And how would you just melted the lead in the
fire?
fire?
Melted the lead on a little stove and poured them into the mold and then took them out of the mold.
Did you paint them at all, or did they just
No, they were
like
just
that?
natural color, kind of silver.
And then you also had ones that would even shoot things.
Yeah, I don't know. We used a board and had some rubber, I think, from an inner tube or something. We could fasten on there and then pull a lever back and shoot a block out or so into the other guy's fort or his soldiers, trying to knock them over.
Were there other people that had these kind of toys like that? It's the first time I've heard of them.
No, I just think we had them. I think the building blocks, a lot of kids had those. Lincoln logs and bricks are some of our older sisters had given them to us for Christmas. So that's how we came about having those. And one of the sisters gave us the mold to make lead soldiers.
That's really neat. And what games all would your father play with you kids?
Not very many. One time he was going to go skating with us, and he put on a pair of skates, and he made 1 or 2 rounds, and they were figure skates, and I guess he wasn't used to them. And he caught, and he tripped, and he fell on the ice pretty hard, and he took the skates off, and that was the end of the skating. He wasn't going to skate with us anymore. And a lot of times, I should mention, too, when we were playing back by the garage behind the house near the garden, we had to be careful as we played games like any eye over the garage, throwing a ball over and somebody going after it and running around the garage. Well, if the ball landed in the garden, we caught heck for that. He didn't want that. And he didn't want us to run in the garden. He would take a rake or a hoe and pull the ball over and give it back to us and warn us a few times.
The garden was very important to us.
Yes.
Neat. Can you tell me about hunting? What you would hunt, where you'd go hunting?
Well, in the fall of the year, there was pheasants to hunt, so we'd do that. And in the winter months, when pheasant season wasn't available, we'd go hunting those cottontail rabbits, not the jackrabbits so much. Well, we did that too, but they weren't edible. We'd maybe sell the fur. And then the cottontail rabbits, Mom would fix that for us on the table. Every time we come in and clean rabbits, she always thought they had some disease, so she made us wash our hands in Lysol water and a lot of soap to disinfect our hands. She insisted on that.
Just with rabbits, though?
Just with rabbits.
Not with pheasants?
No.
That's interesting. Do you have any other hunting stories that you'd like to share?
Oh. It might come to me later if I think of some.
Well, let's talk about fishing a little more. Fishing important to both you and your father. What would you use to begin with for your fishing pole, for your fishing rod?
In the early days, we just use a cane pole. You could buy those at the hardware store. They were very inexpensive. And then as we got older, maybe older brothers or our dad would furnish us with a casting pole and a reel. And fishing wasn't always that good in those days. Today, people have opportunity to catch a lot of northern pike and walleye, and they were kind of scarce. Most of what we caught in those days were bullheads and catfish.
And did you still take those home and eat those?
The catfish in the spring were good, as the water was cold. Right after the ice would go out, after the water would settle down a little bit, and it would still be muddy, but we would put out set lines. I don't know if they were legal, but I don't think they made a big fuss about it in those days. We would go out after school in the afternoon and have 5 or 6 lines with about 10 or 12 or more hooks on them with leaders and bait them up with minnows if we could seine a few minnows to put on them, and set them in overnight. And early in the morning, maybe about 6 in the morning before school would start, we'd hurry up out to the set lines and pull in the fish. And often we'd get 2 or 3 on one line. So it was exciting.
And how did you get the minnows?
We'd have a net to seine them with. We'd go through the creek and put a net out. Sometimes we'd put a trap out overnight, put bread in it and so on. And
so you would
catch quite a few
your
that
own
way.
minnows.
Yes.
And where did you go fishing at most often?
Our dad didn't want us to go in the Missouri River. He thought it was too dangerous, a lot of current there. So there was a tributary called the Heart River, which was about a mile out of town. And sometimes we'd have to go out on our bicycles, or if we had older friends that had a car that their dad would let them use, we could go out in the car and check the lines.
Do you have any other favorite fishing stories?
This one's kind of embarrassing. One time my dad and I were fishing in the Cannonball River on a Sunday afternoon, and I happened to catch a carp, which is not considered a very respectable fish to a lot of people. They're kind of a rough fish, and they're maybe used sometimes. They smoke them in that way, they're more edible, but most of the time we didn't keep a carp. We'd throw it away. Feed it to the birds or something. Get them out of the river so there wouldn't be a lot of reproduction of carp in the river. And this one Sunday when I caught this carp, I said to my dad, "I think I'll keep this one," I said. "What do you want to keep a carp for?" he said. I said, "Well, our neighbor, Lawrence Barrett, is sick and he can't go fishing anymore. And he says," he was from Russia. He had come over from Russia, and he spoke a lot of German yet, and he could even speak Russian. And he told me one time, he says, "Karps is the best of fish. It's the best fish you can have." So I said, if that's true, I'm going to give it to him. He liked carp. I knew he liked them because I remember other times when I was with him, he would always save them, and he would go miles to get some carp. I think he smoked them too. So when I got home, I walked over to our neighbor, Lawrence Barrett, and I said, "Lawrence, I got something for you." "What's that?" I said, "I brought you a fish, a carp." Oh, was he happy. just excited. And he said, "Here, wait a minute." And he got his bottle out and he poured me a little drink. I was old enough to drink by then. And I took a shot of his red eye. And then he said to his wife, "Mary, Mary," he says, "get my purse." I thought he meant a billfold, but he called it a purse. And he gave me $5 for that fish. I said, "Lawrence, I can't take that. My dad will scold me. He'll really be upset if I get money for a carp." And he said, "No, you take it." He said, "You're going to be a priest pretty soon." He says, "And then people won't give you much money." He said, "You got to learn to take money when they offer it to you."
So you ended up having to take it? Did your dad ever find out?
He heard about it.
Oh.
And my older brother teased me too. He thought it was terrible.
You couldn't do much about it. Did you ever go trapping?
You know, not really. A classmate of mine was doing some trapping, and I'd go along with them, but we didn't have much success at all. We probably weren't experienced enough. Maybe we're lucky we didn't catch any, for example, a skunk.
That's true. That's true. Do you remember any rhymes or sayings from when you were a child?
Well, we had to learn poetry in the 8th grade. We had a teacher that was pretty tough, and she made us memorize a poem every week. So I might remember one short one that was something about a thing of beauty is a joy forever. I forgot the rest of it. But my dad told me that his grandpa was a man by the name of Kopp, Grandpa Kopp, John Kopp. And he would oftentimes in Russia even, when there was a wedding, and the priest couldn't be there for the reception for some reason, and they would want somebody to lead them in a prayer. His grandpa rather, would be called on to lead the people in a prayer. And he had a little verse in German, and I wished I had written it down once, but I can't find it anymore. But basically what that prayer said, "We thank you, God, for the food and the drink." Speisen, trinken or something. But we need to remember we are human beings, not animals. So we must be, not go to excess in our food and drink. It had kind of a sermon with it. And it all rhymed. It was in German.
Wow. Do you know if drinking was a problem with the German Russians? Is that why he commented on drinking in moderation?
Well, I think it might be not with German Russians, but with other people too. They like to celebrate. I remember my friend here, Clarence Wickenheiser, he says the Germans are known for 3 things. They work hard, they pray hard, and they play hard. And what they mean by playing hard is celebrating sometimes with the use of alcohol too.
Do you think it got to the point of alcoholism, or they just had a little too much?
Just a little too much, I don't think. There might be an occasional time where someone, I don't think it was only with the Germans, with others too, when they had weddings, they'd celebrate. And where I grew up in Mandan, a lot of times, unfortunately, after a wedding, when they had been drinking, there would be some fights too. The boys would get into some rows.
Rowdy. Well, let's go back to your childhood a little bit. Did you have any superstitions growing up?
I don't remember them if I did.
Did you ever have any scary stories that you and your brothers and sisters would share, or you and your friends?
Well, I don't know. We had a basement under our house, and it was mostly just a dirt basement, and it was awful dark, and so we were scared sometimes to go down there, and especially under the kitchen where there wasn't a full basement, it was just a crawl space, So that we'd kind of sneak by there rather than spend much time there. And then older brothers would tease us too that there were ghosts down there. So.
Did you have a favorite song as a child, or a favorite song that your dad would sing?
Well, I mentioned that song that we'd sing when we'd go in the car, the Whiff and Poof song. That was one of my favorite songs. I could never remember the words to a lot of songs except the Whiff and Poof song. Then I kind of became more familiar with it and would repeat it.
Did he ever sing songs in German?
No, see, I didn't really learn German as a child. After my dad's parents died, I guess my older brothers had learned a little bit while they were still living, the grandparents, but they kind of gave up talking German after the grandparents died. So as younger ones, we never learned it. Our neighbor, some of our best friends, their family still spoke German. And so I learned a little bit of German from them. I took 1 year in college, but it was a different kind of German. It was High German, not what they call Low German, which was what the people here spoke.
So your parents, after your grandparents died, your parents didn't use it much anymore?
Hardly used it anymore. They could understand, but couldn't speak it very well.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that your dad liked to sing. Did anybody else in the family like to sing a lot or play a musical instrument?
None of us, except one sister, she took piano lessons, Sister Caroline. But the rest of us, we loved to sing, but we didn't play any instrument. My younger brother Charles learned on his own kind of how to play the ukulele. So he would, sometimes when we'd go camping or something, he would play that.
Just self-taught?
Yes.
That's really neat. Excuse me. Are there any other stories you'd like to share about playing when you were a child? Or growing up and playing?
Nothing comes to mind just now.
Let's talk about grade school. Where did you go to grade school at?
In our parochial school at St. Joseph's in Mandan, St. Joseph's Parish, they had 8th grades. So I went there all 8th grades, taught by the nuns all those years. Now there aren't any nuns teaching there anymore. They're all lay teachers.
How did you like being taught by the nuns?
Oh, I liked it, yeah.
Did you have a favorite one?
Oh, there are several. The Sister Bernadette, who's still living, she was kind of a easygoing person, not as strict, and she taught us in the 6th grade. She was Irish. She loved to sing too, so we had quite a bit of time for singing every afternoon. She'd kind of expand on that part of the class. And when we were about ready to move on to the 7th grade, we heard there was a sister there that was very strict, and we heard so many stories about how tough she was. So I said to some of my classmates, why don't we see if we can get Sister Bernadette to teach the 7th grade next year, so we could have her again, and we won't get Sister so-and-so who's so strict, And so everybody, kind of promoted that, and she was kind of honored that we wanted her to move on, I think. And so she told us, I talked to the superior, I think, and I'll be able to teach 7th grade next year. And what, lo and behold, happened, the other teacher that was so strict was moved to a different parish, and we wouldn't have had her anyway.
You get your favorite teacher for 2 years.
Yeah, that's right.
If anybody got disciplined, what would the nuns do?
They could be pretty tough. I remember in the 2nd grade, we had a teacher that was very tough, and she would spank kids with the ruler or the yardstick. I think she broke the yardstick on one kid. She had to get another yardstick. And one day when she was going to teach us how to use a ruler to measure, we started mimicking her, and we were spanking ourselves. And she said, if you do that, I'll give you a spanking. And we kind of dared her, I guess, a few of us, and we got another spanking.
So were you a good student, or did you just act up once in a while?
Well, I'd act up, I had to be, I couldn't keep quiet. I'd like to talk too much, I think. And I was telling them in my sermon one day here about my experience when we were one time at home, when late in the evening it was almost time to go to bed, and somebody asked me, did you do all your homework? And we had been playing cards or something. I said, no, I don't think so. I think I forgot something. I'm supposed to write a penance for tomorrow. I must have been talking out of turn or something. I was supposed to write 500 times. I must keep quiet during class or something. So I said, well, they said, how you can't get that done before you go to bed. You won't have time. So they all, my brothers and sisters, helped do my penance. But they said, don't ever pull that again. So they helped me write it out, and I handed it in, and the teacher accepted it. So the handwriting must have been a little different.
I think so. Did they ever help you out?
And what we used to do when we had to do a penance, a written penance, we'd take 2 pencils and write it double, Instead of once, you'd get 2 lines. Whatever you were supposed to write, you cut it in half that way.
Any other discipline stories you'd like to share, whether about you or classmates?
Well, I got sent out of the room one time, too. That was kind of embarrassing. But I wasn't quiet.
Did you have a lot of homework in school?
I think we did, yeah. Towards as we got in the later grades, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, there was quite a bit of work.
Would your older brothers and sisters help you out often if you needed it?
Well, maybe you could lean on them a little bit. They had their homework too.
Did you have a favorite subject in school?
Art. It was easier. And music. But I kind of liked history too. And mathematics I kind of enjoyed.
What didn't you care for?
I don't know, maybe English, maybe. Even after that, I kind of got onto that too and mastered it better. And later on, when I got into college, I forgot everything I learned in math, and I found college algebra pretty tough. I barely got through.
Refresher course. What would you do for recess? What kind of games would you play at recess time?
Well, we had a pretty good-sized playground in our churchyard. They had slides, they had swings for kids, merry-go-rounds. But as we got older, we probably just made up games of like touch football and that, and softball.
What would you take for
handball?
Yeah. Well, how do you play handball?
Well, it's a lot like racquetball,
okay.
But you don't have a racket or a paddle. Just use your bare hand or put a glove on. And the ball was pretty hard. Your hands would swell up after a few games.
And you just hit it. You wouldn't catch it. You just hit the ball.
Just hit it, yeah. Spot it against the wall.
And where would you learn this game?
Already in grade school, one of the priests there had built a handball court, or 2 of them, so the kids could learn handball.
So a lot of the games you learned.
And when I got into high school and college, we had them at the college where I went to school too, and we played it there too. Today they've all gone over to racquetball.
They have done a lot of those. What would you take for lunch? Or would you go home and eat lunch?
We'd go home for lunch. See, we only lived a block and a half from church. Sometimes, like during Lent, we'd take our breakfast to church because we wanted to go to communion. We'd go to Mass, and then school started about 9 o'clock. So we could, after Mass, we could eat our lunch and then go into class. I remember one time, my mother was so busy, she said, "You make your own lunch today." And I said, "Well, how do you make cocoa?" And she said, "Well, you got to milk and chocolate and put some sugar in for the cocoa." And I said, "Where's the sugar?" And she said, "Well, in the cupboard. There's a big container of sugar there." And I didn't see the difference. I took salt, and I put a whole bunch of salt in the cocoa, and when Mass was over and I was eating my lunch and going to have cocoa, I couldn't stand it. I had to go out where the sink was and spit out the cocoa.
Yeah, that couldn't have tasted good at all.
It was horrible. So I didn't have much breakfast that morning.
Did your school celebrate any holidays?
Well, yeah, religious holidays we always celebrated.
Would you just go to Mass, or would you also have a celebration?
Well, we'd be out of school that day. We'd get a free day. We'd go to Mass as family or so, but no school. Like All Saints Day.
So for all the holy days of obligation,
All the holy
you would
days
have those off.
Right. And then we got the civic holidays too, of course.
Would you have to go to school longer then, since you got those extra days off?
I suppose they had to figure a few extra days for that.
Do you remember about when you started school for the year?
Usually in early September.
And it would end about?
End of May.
Okay.
It would go a little longer than what they do nowadays.
What time did you start school in the morning?
About 9 o'clock, 8:45 or 9 o'clock. And we get out about 3:30 in the afternoon.
And how long of a recess, lunch hour would you have?
Usually an hour.
Were you encouraged to go to high school?
Well, it was just understood. And I went to a seminary right away, already in high school. So I left home after the 8th grade. That was kind of hard, being away from home.
You only would have been about 14, right?
Right.
Was getting an education important to your family?
Oh, yes.
Tell me about going to school at the seminary. What was that like, your experience?
Well, we had dormitories and study halls. The study halls are probably about close to 100 in one room, study hall. In the dormitory, the same way.
There were about 100 people studying to become a priest when
Well,
you were in seminary, or?
There might have been a little less than 100. We had 2 study halls, one for those who were studying for the priesthood, one that was studying just to get their education and go on to college.
What would your class load be like in high school at the seminary? What classes would you take?
The same as you would take in any high school, plus Latin, and a religion class too.
Okay. And how did you like living at the seminary?
Well, I thought it was exciting at first, and being away from home, you're a little more on your own, but the teachers, the prefects that were in charge of us, they kept us in line too. We got out of line, and we heard about it.
Can you share some stories of hanging out with the other high school kids that wanted to become a priest? What would you do on your weekends?
Well, we'd stay right there at the seminary. Sometimes we could go into town if we wanted to go there to see a movie, or not very often for a movie, get a haircut. But you could get haircuts right there at the seminary too, and at the college and high school, regular prep school. There were a few students that were barbers. They'd cut your hair for a lot less than you would if you went to town. And then every Saturday night we'd have a movie at the school there. Not the best movies, but they were movies.
And you went to seminary where again?
I started in high school at St. John's, Collegeville, Minnesota. There's a Benedictine monastery there, St. John's Abbey.
Okay.
So there were about 3 or 4 of us from the same town that went there.
And now you would have mixed with people from all over the
yeah.
area.
We had some from the Bahama Islands, and one or two from New York, from Minneapolis, St. Paul. There were a lot of them. When I met one of the kids the first day or so, I said, "Where are you from?" And he says, "Northeast." And I said, "Northeast? What's that?" He said, "Well, Minneapolis." He says, "It's a part of Minneapolis."
Did you have any other activities you would do? Or if you got to go into town, what would you do then?
Well, we had one of our former, she wasn't one of my teachers, but a nun who was living in St. Cloud and teaching in one of the parishes there. And she was always good to us. We'd go and visit her and have a nice visit with her. She'd always encourage us too. So those who knew her, 2 or 3 of us from Mandan, we'd like to visit her.
Now, did your parents have to pay for you to go to the seminary?
Oh yeah, There was tuition, not like tuition you'd have to pay today. And we could also earn some of our tuition by doing some work there at the school. The first year I was peeling potatoes, KP. And after that, from then on, I was usually a table waiter. So that cut our tuition down some. I really don't know how much the tuition was. I don't think it was very much.
Your parents just said they would pay for it. It was important to them.
Sure.
And you wanted to do it. Did you get a lot of advice from your brother that was a priest already as you were?
The first year I came, I was hoping to, but he was sent over to Rome, Italy, to study for 3 years. So I was on my own, except I had a friend, an older, 2 years older than me, that I could lean on a little bit, a neighbor from back in Mandan.
And actually, backing up a little bit, since you were a lot younger than your older brothers and a couple of your sisters, what was it like when they left home? How did you feel about that?
Well, they would come back, like the older brother, he'd come back for Christmas holiday, Easter, and for the whole summer too, for at least the first 4 or 5 years. So I was wanting to be with him a lot and enjoyed his whatever he could give me, and some advice too, I suppose.
So there was some
I was proud of
him.
Yes, I was looking up to him as an older brother.
Good relations there. Yeah. Let's talk about town life a little bit, since you did grow up in town. How big was Mandan when you were growing up about?
I would think probably 7,000 or 8,000 population. It's increased a lot since then.
It's still relatively really good size.
Yes, oh yes.
Was there a difference, or did people treat other people differently? Did the German Russians treat the Norwegians differently in town? Did the Catholics treat the Lutherans different at all?
Well, I think they were distant to each other, and yet they respected each other too. They might make a few remarks or cracks that were putting them down, the other people. Like we thought we were better in the Catholic school than the kids that were going to the public school.
Were there kids of different backgrounds in your grade school that weren't German Russian?
Oh, I'm sure, yes. Some Irish too.
Did the nuns treat any of the students differently?
No, they treated them about the same. They were tough on all of them.
Was there a difference between the town folk and those that came in from the farm?
I thought there was some difference. We kind of thought the country kids didn't have as much education. They were slower. A lot of them, when they'd come in from the country, couldn't speak English as well. They had, probably their first language was German. So I kind of looked down on them too. We shouldn't have, but we did.
I've heard some people say that people referred to the country people as smelly ones, that they smelled all the time.
Oh,
Did you remember anything like that?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay. Were there differences in town between the social classes, between richer people and poorer people?
There was some. We lived on the east side of the town, and they were kind of looked down as poorer people. People on the west end of town were probably from families that had more income, but we still mingled and had no trouble getting along. Just some thought they were a little better than the rest. And then there were the people that lived south of the tracks. They were kind of the poorest of the poor.
And how people would kind of look down upon them a little bit.
Yeah. That part of town was called Dogtown in our days. It was supposed to be the Gerard edition, but nobody ever used that term. They just called it Dogtown. In German, Hundstadt. There were a lot of dogs in that part of town. Maybe that's why.
Did the other sides, the east and west sides, have names also?
No, just call them East Enders, West Enders. Yeah.
Okay.
Then there was a section up north called Happy Hollow, and another place called Sleepy Hollow, or Russian Hollow, where a lot of the German-Russian people lived.
Was that where you would have
We lived a little ways from there. We were more in the central part of town.
Okay. So was the church mainly German-Russians, or was it a mixture of people at the Catholic Church that you went to?
I think predominantly German-Russians in the Catholic Church, but still somewhat of a mixture. There were Irish people too, and probably a few French too. We had only the one parish in town at that time,
Okay. So
one Catholic church.
do you think you were closer with your religious community or just the town community?
Oh, more with the religious community.
Okay. Did the town ever do events for 4th of July or celebrations like that?
Oh yes, they always had a parade and a rodeo on the 4th of July. That brought a lot of people to town.
And that'd be an all-day event with the fireworks and the rodeo?
The rodeo would probably be about a 3-day event. They'd have performances for 3 days and a big parade on the 4th of July.
Would you go to the rodeo and to the parade?
Oh yeah.
Were there special foods that you would get on the 4th of July?
Usually hot dogs. It kind of went with 4th of July.
Did you kids have firecrackers?
Oh yes,
to
we
light
did.
off?
Our dad provided some of those, and then he enjoyed helping us with them at night on the 4th. But sometimes we used up more of them before the 4th, even that we had bought with our own spending money. Neighborhood kids gather together and shoot their fireworks all day long.
Makes it last longer. Would there be any dances in town that you would have gone to?
I don't remember going to dances. 'Cause I'm kind of bashful and scared of girls, I guess. But they had street dances, I think, once in a while.
And you left a little younger as
Yeah,
well.
14 years old.
Now, when you were gone to the seminary, would you come home for all this summer, or did you have
Yes.
to stay there?
For the first 6 years I did.
Okay.
Well, even after that, I'd come home for the whole summer and find some work to earn a little money for school.
So even for high school and then for college, and then
Yes.
later when you were just studying to be a priest.
Yeah,
you would
seminary
still
too.
come home.
Mm-hmm.
How long did it take you to finally become a priest, including your high school years?
Well, 4 years after college.
Oh, it's 4 years after college. What was your first parish that you went to?
Well, the first year I was kind of bounced around helping out different places. My first assignment was only for about a month and a half. I was doing chaplaincy work at a hospital in Dickinson, St. Joe's Hospital.
Were you ever assigned to a German-Russian community?
Oh yes.
Which one?
Not far from here, St. Michael's.
Just on Highway 13?
Yes, right off that. I was there today again. I still help out there.
What was that
I was
like?
only ordained about 2.5 years, and suddenly the bishop said, I want to send you to St. Michael's. The priest that was there was ill and needed to be closer to the doctor. So I was sent up there for about a year, less than a year, from October to August, I think. And I filled in, and I was handicapped and I didn't speak German, because those people did speak German quite a bit. Even the children could speak German, and I couldn't communicate with them in German, and they couldn't figure out why I didn't speak German, the kids, you know. And so then they'd learn to talk to me in English, and I enjoyed that time there. There were good, wonderful people, very strong in their faith. They would come in good numbers all the time for whenever there was church.
About what year were you at St. Michael's?
60 and 61.
Okay.
And while I was there, to keep busy, I came down here to Strasbourg and helped the priest here who had a school. I would teach a couple of classes in school here.
At St. Benedict's?
At St. Benedict's School. That was my first experience in looking at this beautiful church, and I said, oh, I'd love to have this church someday, be pastor here, but I don't think it'll happen because it was a parish that was being supplied by Assumption Abbey, the Benedictine priests. And then sometime in the 80s, they decided to give up the parish and give it back to the diocese to take care of. They had fewer priests, and so and lo and behold, I eventually came here then.
Wow. Now, in the 60s, being at St. Michael's, could you still really notice the German-Russian heritage culture?
Yes.
What parts did you notice were still around?
Well, mainly that they spoke quite a bit of German, that even the children then could speak it, but today you won't find that. It's been lost now, and the children, the present generation, they don't speak German anymore, the children. Their dads might be able to communicate in German, but not the children. They, at Christmas time, they would sing a German or one or two German hymns during the Christmas Mass. Schönste die Kinderlein, beautiful child, little child.
Oh.
Yeah.
Did they still want you to give the homily in German?
No, they didn't expect that.
Okay. They had gotten used to the homily in English by the time you got there. Were there still a lot of German foods around?
Yes, the German food was still quite common. And they would celebrate names days. Have you heard of that?
Somewhat, but...
Names days parties?
Could you elaborate
Well,
on it?
what they would do after Christmas, for example, there's the Feast of St. John. So 2 or 3 men with the name John would say, let's have a party together. And they would meet at one of the homes and invite all the neighbors to come over and celebrate Names Day. And of course they'd have a drink or two, and the ladies would often gather in the kitchen area. The children go down the basement probably and have their fun together, playing games and so on. And the men would be out in the living room. And if somebody had a piano there or so, or some other instrument, they would, or maybe an accordion, they would start singing German songs and just have a wonderful time and visit together late into the evening.
Now, is the Names Day
And have lunch too, of course.
Is the Names Day celebration a tradition from the church, or is it more of a German-Russian tradition?
You know, I'm not sure. Maybe a combination of both. I think the church always considered the names of saints important. They wanted the children to be baptized and be given a saint's name, and probably said, be sure and celebrate your baptism date, not just your birthday. There was an old priest here one time, Father Selder, told the people, he said, even a dog has a birthday, he said, but you're more important. You were baptized a Christian and Catholic. You got to celebrate your date of your baptism. And sometimes when it came to a baptism, if the priest was really pretty tough on people, he would say, what name do you want to give your child? And if it wasn't a saint's name, he said, oh, that won't work. You've got to have a saint's name, you know. And they would rename the child for the parents and say, it's going to be this, you know.
It wasn't required, but the priest would.
He would require it sometimes, yes. The church requires that at least one name be that of a saint, either the middle name or the first name. They would like, they don't require it, but they would certainly strongly urge that.
Either first name or middle name,
yes.
The saint's name. And this is back to even before Vatican II.
Oh,
this
yes.
was kind of the general policy.
Sure.
Interesting. Well, let's go ahead and stop here, because I think we're at the point of discussing religion